Philip IV of France spent 12 hours at a time on the toilet unable to shit, his abdomen swelling until he thought he might explode, while servants inserted their fingers into his rectum to massage his prostate hoping to stimulate some movement. When even that failed, the king would do it himself, working his own oiled finger inside trying to manually break up the hardened stool that refused to come out, and that's exactly how he died, collapsed beside the royal toilet with his hand still inside his own body. When Philip took the throne in 1285, he was just 17 years old and already his body was at war with itself. The problem hadn't started with kingship though, it had started years earlier in his childhood, built meal by meal from the heavy cuisine that medieval nobility believed separated them from common folk. His father had raised him on a simple principle that would destroy his health one mouthful at a time: a strong king must eat like a strong king, which meant consuming massive quantities of food that would challenge even the hardiest digestive system. Every meal was a test of manhood in his father's eyes. Platters of roasted meats so fatty they left pools of grease on the plates, game birds stuffed with organ meats that sat heavy in the stomach for days, thick stews that were more animal fat than actual broth, and bread that wasn't really bread at all but more like compressed lard with flour mixed in as an afterthought. Philip ate this way because refusing would mean appearing weak, and weakness in a prince meant questions about fitness to rule, so he consumed everything placed before him and washed it down with wine so sweet and thick it was basically syrup that happened to be alcoholic. By his early 20s, what had started as occasional stomach discomfort had evolved into something far more sinister and far more constant. He would wake up feeling relatively normal, eat breakfast, and within hours his abdomen would begin to swell and harden, the pressure building inside him like water behind a dam that refused to break. Days would pass without any bowel movement at all, 3 days turning into 4, 4 into 7, and with each passing day the pain would intensify and his belly would distend further until his clothing wouldn't fasten and he had to loosen his belts and wear looser robes just to accommodate the swelling. The sensation was one of being filled beyond capacity, of having something inside that desperately needed to come out but simply wouldn't, no matter how hard he pushed or strained or willed his body to cooperate. His physicians tried everything their limited medieval knowledge could suggest, giving him purgatives that made him cramp and sweat but produced no actual results, concocting bitter herbal mixtures that he forced down despite the vile taste in hopes that this one would finally work, applying heated cloths to his abdomen that left his skin red and tender but did nothing to relieve the pressure building inside. When all these remedies failed, as they almost always did, the king's most trusted body servants would be summoned for a procedure that would become routine over the years but never stopped being deeply humiliating. Philip would position himself on the wooden toilet seat that would become as familiar to him as his throne, and a servant would coat his finger in oil or animal fat and slowly insert it into the king's rectum, probing carefully to locate the prostate gland and the mass of hardened stool that blocked the lower bowel. The massage that followed was methodical and clinical, the servant working to stimulate movement and break up the impaction while Philip gripped the sides of the seat and tried not to cry out from the combination of pressure and relief and violation that the procedure created. Sometimes it worked and his body would finally surrender, evacuating in a rush that left him weak and shaking but blissfully empty for the first time in days. But more often even this direct intervention would fail to fully clear the blockage, leaving him in an agonizing middle state where he was somewhat improved but still fundamentally constipated, still swollen, still trapped in a body that refused to perform its most basic function. The French government didn't operate on a schedule of state business or diplomatic protocol during Philip's reign. It operated on a much more fundamental and unpredictable timeline determined entirely by whether the king had managed to take a shit that morning. This wasn't a minor inconvenience or something that occasionally disrupted court life. It was the central organizing principle around which everything else had to arrange itself, and the people who served Philip quickly learned that knowing the state of the royal bowels was more important than knowing anything about foreign policy or military strategy. Each day began with the same ritual that had nothing to do with prayer or ceremony and everything to do with basic biology: Body servants would emerge from the king's private chambers, and their expressions would tell the waiting courtiers everything they needed to know about how the day would unfold. If Philip had achieved success overnight, if his body had finally cooperated after days of stubborn refusal, then the palace would come alive with activity and purpose, because everyone understood they had a limited window before the next episode would shut everything down again. Meetings would be scheduled rapidly, audiences granted, decisions made with unusual speed, all of it happening in a compressed time frame driven by the knowledge that this productive period might end at any moment when the king's intestines decided to stop working again. But when the servants emerged with tight expressions and subtle shakes of their heads, when it became clear that Philip had spent another fruitless night straining on the toilet to no effect, then everything ground to a halt in a way that was both immediate and absolute. Ambassadors who had traveled for weeks to meet with the French king would find themselves trapped in an indefinite holding pattern, their important diplomatic missions delayed not by political maneuvering or scheduling conflicts but by the simple fact that the monarch was too bloated and uncomfortable to conduct business. Ministers would cancel their plans and settle in for another day of waiting, speaking in whispers as they moved through the palace corridors, because everyone knew the king was suffering and loud noises might disturb him as he continued his agonizing vigil behind closed doors. The royal physicians had essentially given up on finding a cure and instead focused on damage control, maintaining vast collections of herbs and minerals and animal extracts that they mixed into new combinations every day in the desperate hope that this particular formula would finally unlock the secret to making Philip's bowels work reliably. They documented every attempt with careful notation, creating medical records that read like military campaign logs, tracking which remedies produced cramping, which ones caused nausea, which ones seemed to help for a day or two before failing completely. The monks who kept the official court chronicles found themselves maintaining a second, more intimate set of records that tracked something far removed from battles and treaties. They noted every successful bowel movement with the same careful attention they gave to royal births, creating a medical diary that was treated as a state secret but was probably the most honest accounting of any medieval monarch's daily life. During the worst episodes, Philip would essentially disappear from public view for days or even weeks, spending 12 consecutive hours on that toilet seat, his legs going numb from sitting in the same position, his body exhausted from constant straining, occasionally dozing off because he was terrified that if he left he might miss the moment when relief finally came. The manual interventions became more frequent during these severe blockages, with servants called in multiple times per day to perform the rectal massage that sometimes helped and sometimes didn't, and Philip himself learned to do the procedure on his own, working his oiled finger inside because after years of this he knew his own body better than anyone else and could sometimes achieve results that even skilled servants couldn't manage. Power in medieval France had always involved elaborate ceremony and careful protocol, but under Philip's reign it transformed into something that would have been laughable if it wasn't so pathetic, a kind of theatrical production where the most important question wasn't about war or peace but about whether the leading actor could take a shit. The royal apothecary, who in previous reigns had been a relatively minor figure responsible for maintaining basic medical supplies, became one of the most powerful and sought-after positions at court because these men held the king's desperate hope in their hands every single day. They weren't just mixing remedies anymore, they were conducting what amounted to full-time research into constipation, devoting their entire professional lives to the singular goal of making one man's bowels work properly, and their success or failure in this quest had consequences that reached far beyond the toilet. An apothecary who claimed to have a new solution would find himself suddenly elevated to a position of enormous influence, granted access to the king that senior nobles couldn't get, given resources and funding that military commanders would envy, all because he promised that this time, this particular mixture of herbs or this specific technique would finally solve the problem that had haunted Philip for decades. And when the remedy inevitably failed, as almost all of them did, that same apothecary might find himself dismissed in disgrace or worse, having raised hopes that crashed back down into the same familiar cycle of pain and bloating and fruitless straining. The strangest part of the whole situation, the detail that really captured how completely absurd things had become, was what happened on those increasingly rare days when Philip finally achieved relief after a prolonged bout of constipation. Church bells would ring out across Paris, and if you didn't know better you'd think France had won a major military victory or signed a crucial treaty, but the actual reason for the celebration was simply that the king had successfully moved his bowels after days or weeks of failure. Priests would offer prayers of thanksgiving in the royal chapel. Nobles would gather in their formal dress to attend special masses where they gave thanks for the fact that their monarch's digestive system had started working again, and the king himself, feeling physically lighter and emotionally euphoric from finally escaping the constant pressure and discomfort, would be in such a generous mood that he'd grant favors and make pronouncements that he'd probably reconsider later when the next episode hit. The palace kitchens would prepare elaborate feasts to celebrate these successful evacuations, with musicians summoned and wine flowing freely, though the physicians would plead for lighter foods that might help maintain the king's improved condition rather than the heavy meats and rich gravies that had created the problem in the first place. Philip rarely listened to these pleas because he remained convinced that eating like a strong king was essential to projecting strength, so within days he'd be back to consuming the same heavy diet that his body couldn't process, and the whole cycle would begin again with depressing inevitability. Foreign ambassadors trapped in this bizarre system would write home with barely concealed frustration about the strange customs of the French court, unable to say directly that they were waiting for the king to shit but hinting at some mysterious illness that seemed to take precedence over everything else, including matters of international importance. What made Philip's reign so remarkable wasn't that he suffered from this condition, it was that he somehow managed to accomplish genuinely impressive things while spending enormous amounts of time sitting on a toilet in agony trying to make his body work. This was the same man who engineered the total destruction of the Knights Templar in 1307, coordinating the simultaneous arrest of the entire order across France on the same day and seizing their legendary wealth, and he did all of this while frequently being so bloated and constipated that he couldn't leave his private chambers. He orchestrated the humiliation of Pope Boniface VIII, sending soldiers to physically assault the pontiff and establishing French dominance over the papacy that would last for generations, yet he planned and executed this campaign while depending on servants to stick their fingers in his ass several times a week just so he could defecate. He expanded French territory through clever marriages and strategic acquisitions, reformed the judicial system to strengthen royal authority, developed new taxation methods that brought unprecedented revenue to the crown, and centralized power to a degree that made France the strongest kingdom in Europe, accomplishing all of this despite spending hours every single day in a position that was both agonizing and deeply humiliating. The contradiction between his public achievements and his private suffering created two completely different versions of the same person. Philip the political figure was cold and calculating and seemingly invincible, ruthless in his willingness to destroy anyone who challenged his authority, but Philip the physical person was trapped in a daily nightmare of dysfunction and dependence, unable to perform functions that every peasant in France managed without thinking about it. His reputation for cruelty and his tendency toward paranoid suspicion might have been shaped by the constant pain he endured, the psychological toll of living every day with the knowledge that his body had fundamentally betrayed him and no amount of power or wealth could fix it. There were extended periods during his reign when he spent the majority of each day on that toilet, essentially imprisoned by his own biology, trying every position and technique he could think of, working his finger inside himself for hours in the hope that he could manually break up whatever was blocking him, while outside his chamber the business of ruling France continued in an improvised way that gradually undermined the absolute authority he was trying to project. His advisors learned to make decisions without consulting him during these episodes because waiting for the king to become available might mean waiting for weeks, and so the very centralization of power that Philip worked so hard to achieve was slowly eroded by the practical necessity of keeping the government running when its head was incapacitated by constipation. By late 1314, Philip's body was clearly failing in ways that went beyond the chronic constipation that had plagued him for 3 decades. He was 46 years old, which wasn't exceptionally old by medieval standards, but he looked much older, worn down by years of constant pain and the physical toll of spending so much time straining and pushing and manually trying to clear blockages that his body should have cleared naturally. The episodes had become more frequent and more severe, the periods of relief shorter and less complete, and there was a sense among those who attended him that something fundamental was breaking down in ways that might not be fixable even if medieval medicine had been capable of fixing anything. November 29th started like so many other bad days, with Philip waking to find his abdomen swollen tight and hard, the familiar pressure already building even though he hadn't eaten anything since the previous afternoon. He made his way to the toilet that had become the true seat of his power, more significant in his daily life than the actual throne, and he dismissed his servants because after all these years he sometimes preferred to handle the worst episodes alone rather than endure their presence during his most vulnerable moments. Hours passed with Philip sitting there, trying everything that had occasionally worked in the past, pushing and straining until his face went purple, working his oiled finger inside to massage his prostate and try to break up the hardened mass he could feel but couldn't dislodge. The pain in his abdomen intensified beyond anything he'd experienced before, sharper and more focused, the pressure building to a level that felt genuinely dangerous rather than just uncomfortable. He tried different positions, tried bearing down with all the strength he had left, tried the manual technique that had sometimes provided at least partial relief, but nothing was moving and the pain was becoming unbearable in a way that felt fundamentally different from all the previous episodes. Something gave way inside him, whether a blood vessel burst from the pressure or his intestine finally ruptured from the strain, and Philip's body made a decision that his conscious mind hadn't authorized. It simply stopped fighting. The servants found him hours later when they finally worked up the courage to check on their king after the concerning sounds from behind the closed door had given way to troubling silence. Philip lay collapsed beside the toilet, his body grotesquely swollen and mottled with the discoloration that comes after death, one hand still positioned where it had been during his final attempt to manually extract the blockage that had killed him. The Iron King who had destroyed the Templars and dominated the Catholic Church and made France the most feared power in Europe had died exactly as he'd lived for the past 30 years, alone with his dysfunctional bowels, his finger in his own rectum, trying desperately to do what his body would no longer allow. The official chronicles recorded a death from natural causes after brief illness. The funeral proceeded with all appropriate ceremony for a deceased monarch, but everyone who had served Philip closely knew the humiliating truth of how he'd actually died, brought down not by enemies or disease but by his own intestines, proving that even absolute power means nothing when your body decides it's done cooperating.